For months, one of the biggest debates surrounding Shedeur Sanders hasn't actually been about what he's doing on the football field. Instead, it's been about what certain people keep saying he's incapable of doing. Long before training camp battles, preseason performances, or meaningful NFL opportunities could provide answers, some voices had already reached their verdict. The conclusion seemed permanent. Shedeur Sanders wasn't ready. Shedeur Sanders wasn't consistent. Shedeur Sanders wasn't the future of the Cleveland Browns. And no matter what happened afterward, that narrative never seemed to change. What's making fans raise their eyebrows now isn't the criticism itself. Every young quarterback faces criticism. That's part of the job. What has people talking is the growing gap between what some media personalities continue to say and what the people inside the Browns organization are actually reporting. While public criticism keeps repeating the same concerns, coaches, executives, and insiders have been painting a very different picture behind the scenes. And the more that picture comes into focus, the harder it becomes to ignore. Think about it for a second. If a quarterback were truly struggling the way some critics claim, would coaches continue praising his development? Would executives repeatedly highlight his progress? Would respected football minds continue talking about his growth and potential? Those questions are becoming impossible to avoid as more comments emerge from inside the building. Because while the outside noise remains loud, the people evaluating Shedeur every single day appear to be seeing something completely different. And that's where this story takes an unexpected turn. The debate is no longer just about whether Shedeur Sanders can play, it's becoming a debate about who fans should trust. The commentators delivering the same warnings they've repeated for months, or the coaches and decision-makers who are actually watching every practice, every meeting, and every step of his development firsthand. The answer may end up reshaping not only the Browns' future, but also the credibility of some of the loudest voices covering this team. What makes this even more fascinating is that the evidence keeps piling up. Every new practice report, every positive evaluation, and every endorsement from inside the organization creates another crack in a narrative that many thought was already settled. Yet despite those developments, some critics haven't moved an inch. They've stood in the exact same spot, making the exact same arguments, while the situation around them continues to evolve. And if Shedeur Sanders keeps progressing the way Browns officials claim he is, this conversation could soon become about far more than a quarterback competition. It could become a story about assumptions, reputations, and what happens when a narrative refuses to match reality. Because what we're about to uncover isn't just a disagreement over football, it's a collision between perception and evidence. And the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to ignore what's really happening in Cleveland. The most surprising part of this entire story is that many of the strongest opinions about Shedeur Sanders appeared long before there was enough NFL evidence to justify them. Before the first meaningful training camp battle, before preseason snaps could be evaluated, before coaches had months of meetings, practices, and film sessions to study. Somehow, conclusions were already being presented with remarkable confidence. The discussion wasn't centered on what Shedeur might become. For some people, the discussion seemed settled before it even began. A major reason for that was where his name appeared on draft weekend. When Shedeur wasn't selected as early as many expected, the conversation shifted almost overnight. Instead of focusing on his strengths, countless debates became centered on one simple number: his draft position. Suddenly, every evaluation seemed to end there. To some critics, the fact that teams passed on him multiple times became all the evidence they needed. The draft slot itself became the argument. The problem is that NFL history has never worked that way. Every year, talented players outperform their draft position. Every year, highly selected prospects disappoint. Teams miss, scouts miss, analysts miss. That's simply part of football. Yet when it came to Shedeur Sanders, some observers treated his draft position less like one piece of information and more like a permanent verdict. The possibility that he could develop, improve, or exceed expectations rarely seemed to enter the conversation. What made the situation even more unusual was how quickly the criticism became repetitive. The same concerns surfaced again and again. He wasn't ready, he wasn't polished enough, he wasn't capable of leading a franchise. The wording sometimes changed, but the overall message stayed remarkably consistent. As practices came and went, the conclusion rarely moved. New information entered the picture, yet the destination somehow remained exactly the same.
That's why so many fans started noticing a pattern. Whenever positive reports surfaced, they were often accompanied by a disclaimer. If Shedeur had a strong practice, the response became that it was only one day. If he followed it with another solid performance, attention shifted toward what could go wrong next. If coaches praised his development, skepticism immediately followed. It created the impression that every positive sign needed to be explained away before it could gain momentum. And that's where the debate started changing, because criticism is supposed to evolve when new information emerges. That's how honest evaluation works. You observe, you analyze, and then you adjust when the facts change. But some observers appeared locked into a position that never moved regardless of what happened on the field. Whether reports were positive or negative, the final conclusion seemed predetermined. To be clear, questioning a young quarterback isn't unusual. Every prospect enters the league with flaws and uncertainties. That's normal. The NFL is filled with examples of players who struggled to meet expectations. Nobody is arguing that Shedeur Sanders should be immune from criticism. The real question is whether the criticism was being driven by evidence or by an opinion that had already been formed long before the evaluation process was complete. Because once that possibility enters the conversation, everything starts looking different. Suddenly, every negative headline feels less like an independent observation and more like part of a larger narrative. Every warning sounds familiar. Every concern begins echoing previous concerns. And before long, fans aren't just evaluating the quarterback anymore, they're evaluating the people evaluating the quarterback. The timing makes this impossible to ignore. As Shedeur continued spending time in meetings, learning the offense, and working through the challenges every rookie faces, some of the loudest criticisms remained frozen in place. The development process was moving forward, the conversation around him often wasn't, and that disconnect would become even more noticeable once people inside the Browns organization started speaking publicly. Because while the outside world kept debating what Shedeur couldn't do, coaches were beginning to focus on something completely different. They weren't talking about draft position. They weren't discussing media narratives. They were talking about growth. They were talking about improvement. They were talking about progress. And that's where the inconsistency argument began taking center stage. But once that argument is examined closely, the story becomes a lot more complicated than many people realize. The word that keeps appearing whenever critics discuss Shedeur Sanders is inconsistent. It's become one of the most repeated descriptions attached to his name. Mention a strong practice, and someone points to a bad throw from a previous session. Highlight positive reports from coaches, and the conversation quickly circles back to inconsistency. It's a term that's been used so often that many fans have started accepting it without stopping to ask a simple question. What exactly does consistency look like for a young quarterback still learning the NFL? That's where this argument becomes far more complicated than it first appears, because when most people hear the word inconsistent, they immediately assume it points to a flaw within the player himself. They picture poor decision-making, lack of preparation, or an inability to perform under pressure. But football isn't that simple. Quarterback development rarely follows a straight line. In fact, some of the league's most successful quarterbacks experienced dramatic ups and downs during their early years before eventually becoming stars. What often gets overlooked is how many factors influence a young quarterback's performance. Learning an NFL playbook isn't like memorizing a few formations. It's an entirely different language. Quarterbacks must process defensive alignments in seconds, adjust protections, recognize disguised coverages, communicate with teammates, and deliver accurate throws under intense pressure. Every snap becomes a test of mental processing just as much as physical talent. Mistakes are not only expected, they're practically unavoidable. Yet when conversations surrounding Shedeur take place, those realities sometimes disappear. Instead, isolated moments become the centerpiece of larger arguments. One inaccurate throw can overshadow an entire day of solid work. One difficult practice can suddenly become evidence supporting a conclusion that was already waiting to be reached. It's as if every mistake is treated as confirmation, while every success is treated as an exception. That approach creates a dangerous imbalance. If positive performances are dismissed as small sample sizes, while negative moments are treated as proof, then the evaluation process stops being objective. The standard becomes impossible to satisfy. No young quarterback could realistically develop under those conditions because the goalposts keep moving. Every sign of improvement is met with skepticism, while every mistake is magnified.
What's particularly interesting is that consistency itself isn't always measured equally across different players. Around the league, rookie quarterbacks regularly struggle with accuracy, timing, and decision-making as they adjust to NFL speed. Fans and analysts often describe those struggles as part of the learning process. They're framed as growing pains, necessary steps in development. But in Shedeur's case, similar struggles have sometimes been presented as evidence that he may never overcome them. That's why context matters so much. A quarterback's performance doesn't exist in a vacuum. Practice reps matter, coaching matters, timing matters, opportunity matters. The environment surrounding a young player can dramatically impact his ability to develop. When evaluating inconsistency, it's important to ask whether the player is solely responsible for the fluctuations or whether the circumstances around him are contributing factors as well. This is where supporters of Shedeur Sanders believe an important piece of the conversation has been ignored. They argue that focusing exclusively on imperfect throws or uneven stretches misses the bigger picture. Development isn't measured by eliminating every mistake overnight. It's measured by how quickly a player learns from those mistakes, adapts, and improves over time. And according to people inside the organization, that's exactly what has been happening. Even more revealing is the fact that the Browns themselves don't appear to be evaluating Shedeur through the same lens as some of his critics. While public discussions continue revolving around inconsistency, coaches have increasingly focused on his understanding of the offense, his processing speed, and his ability to make adjustments. Those aren't the comments of people searching for reasons to move on. They're the comments of people tracking long-term growth. And that's where the inconsistency narrative starts running into a major obstacle. Because if Shedeur truly were struggling to the degree some critics suggest, why do the people responsible for his development keep talking about progress? Why do coaches continue emphasizing improvement rather than disappointment? Why do executives sound increasingly encouraged instead of concerned? The answer may lie in something many outside observers never get to see. Coaches evaluate far more than the public ever hears about. They watch meeting room habits, they track decision-making, they study how quickly players absorb corrections, they monitor leadership, communication, and preparation. The evaluation process extends far beyond a handful of throws during practice. And once those internal evaluations began reaching the public, the conversation surrounding Shedeur Sanders started taking a dramatic turn. Because while critics continued debating inconsistency, the people working with him every day were delivering a very different message, one that would soon become impossible to ignore. The moment this debate started changing was the moment people stopped focusing on what outside commentators were saying and started paying attention to what Browns coaches were actually saying. Because whether fans realize it or not, there's a massive difference between analyzing a player from afar and evaluating him every single day inside the building. One group sees practice highlights, media reports, and occasional clips. The other group sees every meeting, every rep, every correction, every mistake, and every improvement. When those two groups tell completely different stories, it's worth asking why. One of the strongest endorsements came from offensive coordinator Todd Monken, and what made his comments so important wasn't simply that they were positive, it was the specific areas he chose to highlight. Coaches can always offer generic praise if they want to avoid controversy. They can say a player is working hard. They can say he's improving. They can keep their comments vague and non-committal. But that's not what happened here. Instead, Monken focused on details that matter tremendously when evaluating a quarterback. He spoke about his progressions. He talked about getting the ball out faster. He discussed his understanding of offensive concepts. Those aren't surface-level compliments. Those are core elements of quarterback development. In many ways, they're the exact traits coaches monitor most closely when determining whether a young player is capable of leading an NFL offense. What stood out even more was the language Monken used. He didn't describe the growth as small. He didn't suggest minor improvements. He didn't sound hesitant or uncertain. Instead, he emphasized that Shedeur had come a long way in those critical areas. That's an important distinction, because coaches generally choose their words carefully. Public comments are often measured. They're designed to avoid creating unrealistic expectations. Yet Monken sounded genuinely encouraged by what he was seeing. That matters, because quarterback development is rarely about making spectacular throws. Fans love highlights, social media loves deep passes and impossible completions, but coaches often care about something completely different. They want quarterbacks who understand where to go with the football. They want players who can identify defenses before the snap. They want decision-makers who can execute an offense consistently under pressure. The flashy plays come later. The mental foundation comes first. And according to Monken's evaluation, that foundation appeared to be improving rapidly.
That's why the disconnect between public criticism and internal evaluations became so difficult to ignore. While some observers continued focusing on isolated mistakes, Brown's coaches seemed far more interested in the overall trajectory. They weren't asking whether Shedeur was already a finished product. They were asking whether he was developing into one. And based on their comments, the answer appeared increasingly positive. The praise didn't stop there. As off-season practices continued, multiple reports coming out of the organization painted a similar picture. Coaches repeatedly emphasized growth rather than concern, progress rather than regression, development rather than disappointment. That's not to suggest they believed Shedeur was perfect. No rookie quarterback is, but their comments reflected optimism, not alarm. Perhaps the most telling part of all this is that coaches have very little incentive to exaggerate. Their jobs depend on winning games. Their reputations depend on identifying talent correctly. If a quarterback isn't progressing, coaches usually know it long before anyone else. They spend countless hours reviewing film, studying habits, and tracking development. They're not guessing, they're evaluating. That's what makes these comments carry so much weight. They aren't coming from people trying to generate headlines. They aren't coming from television personalities competing for attention. They're coming from individuals whose careers depend on getting quarterback evaluations right. Every positive assessment carries far more significance because it comes from people with direct access to the evidence. And then, another important detail began emerging. The Browns weren't just praising Shedeur's current performance, they were praising how quickly he was learning. That distinction is enormous. Coaches know that talent alone doesn't guarantee success. What often separates quarterbacks who make it from those who don't is their ability to absorb information, adapt, and improve over time. By emphasizing his understanding of the offense and his growth within the system, Brown's coaches were pointing towards something deeper than a few successful practices. They were suggesting that the developmental process itself was working. The quarterback who entered the building months earlier wasn't the same quarterback they were seeing now. That kind of growth is exactly what organizations hope to see from young players. And if those internal evaluations were accurate, then the public conversation surrounding Shedeur Sanders was missing a huge part of the story. But while Todd Monken's comments grabbed headlines, they weren't the strongest endorsement coming from inside the organization. Because soon, another powerful voice stepped into the conversation, and what he said made it even harder to dismiss what was happening behind the scenes. That voice belonged to the man responsible for helping build the Browns' future in the first place. If Todd Monken's comments forced people to reconsider what was happening with Shedeur Sanders behind closed doors, then Andrew Berry's remarks took that conversation to an entirely different level. Coaches can become excited about development. That's part of their job. They work closely with players every day and naturally focus on improvement. But when the general manager starts publicly expressing confidence in a young quarterback, people tend to pay attention for a very different reason. Unlike coaches, general managers are responsible for the long-term future of an entire franchise. Every roster decision, every draft pick, every contract, and every personnel move eventually traces back to them. Their evaluations carry enormous weight because they're constantly thinking years ahead rather than weeks ahead. They aren't simply focused on the next practice, they're focused on building a team capable of sustained success. That's why Barry's comments caught so many people by surprise. As questions about Shedeur's development continued circulating, Barry repeatedly described his offseason progress in extremely positive terms. What stood out wasn't just the praise itself, it was how confidently that praise was delivered. There was no hesitation, no careful distancing, no attempt to lower expectations. Instead, Barry openly discussed the progress Sanders had made over an extended period of time, emphasizing that the development wasn't something that suddenly appeared during a few practices. According to Barry, the improvement stretched back months. That detail matters more than many people realize. It's one thing for a quarterback to string together a few strong days during organized team activities. It's another thing entirely for an organization to see growth taking place over 6 months across multiple phases of development, long before the public ever notices it. That suggests a process rather than a temporary hot streak. It suggests habits being built, lessons being absorbed, and a player gradually becoming more comfortable inside the system. For critics who continued arguing that Shedeur's positive reports were being exaggerated, Barry's timeline created a significant problem. Because the general manager wasn't describing a brief moment of success, he was describing a pattern. He was pointing towards steady development that began well before cameras arrived at practice fields. And perhaps most importantly, Barry sounded genuinely excited about what could come next. Organizations are typically careful when discussing young quarterbacks. NFL history is filled with prospects who showed promise before struggling when real games began. Front offices understand that reality better than anyone. That's why executives often choose cautious language when speaking publicly. They avoid making definitive statements. They leave room for uncertainty. Barry's comments felt different. While he didn't crown Shedeur as the future of the franchise, his tone reflected confidence in the direction of the player's development. He spoke about progress, he highlighted growth, he emphasized work being done behind the scenes. The message wasn't that Shedeur had already arrived, the message was that he was moving exactly where the organization wanted him to go. That's a critical distinction because it reveals how the Browns may actually be evaluating this competition internally. Outside observers often become obsessed with immediate results. They want to know who won today's practice, who threw the best pass, who looked the sharpest during a particular session. Organizations look at a much bigger picture. They ask different questions. Is the player improving? Is he learning from mistakes? Is he becoming more comfortable within the offense? Is his understanding of the system growing? Can he handle more responsibility than he could a few months ago? Those questions ultimately determine whether a quarterback becomes a long-term solution, and based on Barry's comments, the answers appearing inside the Browns building seemed increasingly encouraging. What's fascinating is how this created an unusual contrast with some of the public criticism surrounding Shedeur. On one side, there were commentators continuing to emphasize uncertainty. On the other, there was the general manager openly discussing months of development and improvement. The two narratives weren't merely different. In many ways, they were moving in opposite directions. The more Barry spoke, the harder it became to argue that the organization lacked confidence in Sanders' potential. That doesn't mean he had already won a starting job. It doesn't mean every concern had disappeared. But it did reveal something important. The people making decisions inside the Browns facility appeared far more optimistic than many people outside of it. And then, another interesting thing started happening. The shift wasn't limited to Cleveland anymore. For months, national analysts had echoed many of the same concerns being heard locally. Questions about draft position, questions about readiness, questions about whether the spotlight surrounding Shedeur Sanders exceeded the reality.
But as more information emerged from Cleveland and more evaluations became public, some of those national voices began changing their tone. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that something was changing. And when national analysts start revisiting opinions they once sounded certain about, that's usually a sign that the evidence is becoming impossible to ignore. One of the clearest signs that a narrative is beginning to crack isn't when supporters become louder, it's when former skeptics start sounding less certain. That's exactly what has made the recent conversations surrounding Shedeur Sanders so fascinating. For months, many national media personalities seemed completely comfortable presenting their evaluations as if the outcome had already been decided. The concerns were familiar. Questions about whether his success at Colorado would translate to the NFL. Questions about the spotlight surrounding his family created unrealistic expectations. Questions about his draft position and what it supposedly revealed about how NFL teams viewed him. Those criticisms weren't uncommon, and in many cases they were presented with a level of certainty that left little room for alternative outcomes. But something interesting started happening as more information began emerging from Cleveland. The confidence behind some of those negative predictions slowly started fading, not disappearing entirely, but softening. The conversation wasn't centered solely on what Shedeur couldn't do anymore. Suddenly, there was more discussion about what he might become, more acknowledgement that development was taking place, more recognition that the situation might be more complicated than originally believed. What makes this shift important isn't that analysts are suddenly declaring Shedeur Sanders a future superstar. That's not what's happening. The significance lies in the fact that some of the same voices who once sounded completely convinced are now leaving room for uncertainty. And in sports, uncertainty often tells you more than confidence ever can. When analysts become willing to reconsider a position, it usually means new evidence has entered the equation. It means something they're seeing doesn't fully match the story they were previously telling. That's how honest evaluation works. People gather information, make judgments, and then adjust those judgments when circumstances change. The best analysts in any sport aren't the ones that are always right. They're the ones willing to update their opinions when reality gives them a reason to do so. That's why the recent tone shift from several national commentators has been impossible to ignore. The conversation has become less about dismissing Shedeur outright and more about watching his development unfold. The certainty that once dominated many discussions has gradually been replaced by curiosity. That transition may seem small on the surface, but it's actually a major development. Think about how rare it is for public figures to move away from strong opinions, especially in today's sports media environment. Bold takes generate attention, extreme predictions generate headlines. Admitting that a situation might be more complicated than originally believed doesn't create nearly as much excitement. Yet, that's exactly what's been happening. Analysts who once highlighted every perceived weakness are now spending more time discussing areas where Shedeur has improved. Voices that once focused almost exclusively on concerns are acknowledging positive reports coming out of Brown's practices. The language has changed. Instead of speaking in absolutes, they're speaking in possibilities. Instead of presenting conclusions, they're asking questions. And whenever that happens, it's usually a sign that the evidence is becoming difficult to dismiss.
The NFL has seen this pattern countless times before. Every year, players enter the league carrying labels that follow them everywhere. Some are viewed as future stars before they've earned it. Others are treated as long shots before they've been given a real opportunity. Then, reality arrives. Players develop, situations change, assumptions get challenged. Suddenly, the labels that once seemed permanent start looking less reliable. The league is filled with stories of overlooked players who exceeded expectations and highly praised prospects who struggled to live up to the hype. That's why smart evaluators understand that development doesn't happen on a fixed timeline. Quarterbacks especially can change dramatically over the course of a single offseason. Improvements that seem minor to fans can completely alter how coaches view a player's future. That's part of what makes evaluating young quarterbacks so difficult.
The player people see today isn't necessarily the player they'll see 6 months from now. What's particularly revealing in Shedeur's case is the contrast between those who have adjusted their tone and those who haven't. While some national analysts have become more open-minded as positive reports continue emerging, others remain locked into the exact same position they've held from the beginning. The evidence may have changed, the evaluations from inside the organization may have changed, the reports from practices may have changed, yet certain opinions remain completely untouched by any of it. That's what has started drawing attention from fans. People naturally expect opinions to evolve when new information becomes available. They don't necessarily expect everyone to become believers, but they do expect evaluations to reflect reality as it develops. When that doesn't happen, questions inevitably follow. And those questions are becoming more difficult to avoid. If respected coaches are publicly praising Shedeur's growth, why should those comments be dismissed immediately? If executives responsible for building the franchise continue expressing confidence, why assume they're exaggerating? If multiple reports continue highlighting progress, why pretend those reports don't exist? None of these questions guarantee success. None of them prove that Shedeur Sanders will become a franchise quarterback. Football doesn't work that way. Plenty of promising players have failed to meet expectations. Plenty of positive offseason stories have ended in disappointment. But that's exactly the point. If uncertainty is acceptable when discussing his chances of success, then uncertainty should also be acceptable when discussing his chances of failure. The outcome remains unwritten, which is why some analysts have started treating it that way. And perhaps that's the biggest difference between the conversations happening now and the conversations that were happening months ago. Earlier discussions often sounded like verdicts. Today's discussions sound more like evaluations. Earlier conversations focused on what couldn't happen. Today's conversations are increasingly focused on what might happen. That's a significant change, and it reflects a broader recognition that the story surrounding Shedeur Sanders is still unfolding. The problem for those who have refused to adjust is that every positive report, every encouraging evaluation, and every endorsement from inside the Browns organization makes their certainty harder to defend. As more people begin reconsidering old assumptions, attention naturally shifts toward those who continue repeating the same arguments regardless of what new evidence emerges. And that's when the discussion starts moving beyond football itself. Because once some analysts began softening their positions while others remained firmly planted in theirs, a different question started gaining traction among fans. What if the reactions to Shedeur Sanders weren't entirely about his performance? What if some of the emotions surrounding this debate was connected to something much larger than a quarterback competition? That possibility became even more interesting when Shedeur himself addressed an issue that had quietly been lingering beneath the surface of the conversation for months. And once he said it publicly, an entirely new layer of this story began coming into focus. At this point in the story, an uncomfortable question begins to emerge. If some analysts are changing their evaluations as new information becomes available, while others remain firmly committed to the same conclusions, what exactly is driving that divide? Is it simply a disagreement over football? Is it a difference in how people evaluate quarterbacks? Or could there be another factor influencing how Shedeur Sanders is being perceived? It's a question that has been discussed quietly among fans for months, and interestingly enough, Shedeur himself eventually addressed it. According to comments that generated significant discussion online, Shedeur suggested that much of the criticism directed towards him may actually stem from opinions people already hold about his father, Deion Sanders. He didn't present it as a conspiracy. He didn't launch into a lengthy defense. Instead, he offered what appeared to be his personal perspective on why reactions to him often feel more intense than those faced by many other young quarterbacks. His argument was simple. When your father is one of the most recognizable and polarizing figures in football, separating the son from the father becomes difficult for some people.
Now, it's important to be careful here because motives are impossible to prove. Nobody can look inside another person's mind and know exactly why they hold a particular opinion.
Any suggestion that criticism is automatically connected to Deion Sanders would be speculation, not fact. However, what cannot be denied is that Deion Sanders has always generated strong reactions. Throughout his playing career, his coaching career, and virtually every stage of his public life, people have rarely been neutral about him. They either admire his confidence and success or strongly disagree with his style and approach. There has rarely been much middle ground. That's why the possibility raised by Shedeur resonated with so many supporters. They weren't necessarily claiming that every critic was secretly motivated by feelings about Deion. Instead, they were pointing out something much simpler. Fair or unfair, the Sanders name carries baggage. It carries expectations. It carries assumptions. And when a young quarterback enters the NFL with that name on the back of his jersey, he's not walking into a neutral environment. He's walking into a conversation that has already been taking place for decades. Think about the position Shedeur has occupied throughout his football journey. Long before he became an NFL prospect, he was already one of the most discussed young athletes in the country. Every performance generated headlines. Every success attracted attention. Every mistake was amplified. That's not the experience most quarterbacks have. Many prospects develop quietly before reaching the national spotlight. Shedeur entered the spotlight years ago. As a result, opinions about him were often formed long before NFL evaluators ever started studying his film. In many ways, that's what makes this situation so unique. Some players arrive in the league as relatively blank slates. Fans evaluate them based almost entirely on what happens at the professional level. Shedeur didn't have that luxury. By the time he entered the NFL, people already had strong opinions about him. Some viewed him as a future star. Others viewed him as overhyped. Some believed he would thrive under pressure. Others were convinced the attention surrounding him exceeded his actual ability. Those opinions existed before he ever threw an NFL pass. And that's where things become particularly interesting, because once opinions become emotionally attached to a larger story, changing those opinions becomes much harder. Football evaluations are supposed to evolve as new evidence emerges, but when discussions become tied to broader narratives, objectivity can sometimes become more difficult. People stop evaluating what they're seeing in the moment and start defending conclusions they reached long ago. Again, that doesn't mean it's happening in every case, but it's one possible explanation for why reactions to Shedeur often seem stronger than reactions to other young quarterbacks in similar situations. What's undeniable is that Deion Sanders remains one of the most influential figures in modern football. His success, his personality, his confidence, and visibility guarantee attention wherever he goes. That attention inevitably follows his son. For some fans, that's an advantage. For others, it's a burden. Every accomplishment gets scrutinized. Every setback gets magnified. Every discussion becomes larger than football itself. That's simply the reality of carrying a name that powerful. Ironically, the person who seems least interested in debating any of this is Shedeur himself. While discussions rage across television shows, radio programs, podcasts, and social media platforms, his focus appears centered on something far more practical: learning the offense, improving his mechanics, earning trust inside the locker room, competing for opportunities. The things that ultimately determine whether a quarterback succeeds in the NFL have very little to do with public debates and everything to do with performance. And that's why this entire discussion may eventually become irrelevant. Whether criticism is motivated purely by football, influenced by preconceived opinions, or shaped by larger narratives surrounding the Sanders family, none of those factors will matter once real games begin. The NFL has always been the ultimate truth detector. Narratives can dominate headlines for months, debates can consume entire fan bases, opinions can divide analysts and supporters, but eventually, players step onto the field and force everyone to confront reality. Which brings us to the most important question of all. What happens if Shedeur Sanders continues developing at the rate Browns coaches believe he is? What happens if the progress praised by Todd Monken and Andrew Berry starts showing up under the bright lights of actual NFL competition? Because if that happens, this story won't just be about a quarterback proving himself. It will become about everyone who spent months insisting it could never happen. For all the debates, all the headlines, and all the arguments surrounding Shedeur Sanders, the reality is that none of them will matter if he ultimately wins the job and performs. That's what makes the next phase of this story so fascinating. Right now, everyone still has room to defend their position. Supporters can point to positive reports from coaches and executives. Critics can point to the fact that he hasn't proven anything in a regular season NFL game yet. Both sides can still argue their case because the final chapter hasn't been written. But the moment Shedeur steps onto the field as Cleveland's quarterback, everything changes. The discussion immediately shifts from projections to results, and that's where reputations are either validated or exposed.
What's particularly interesting is how much pressure exists beyond the quarterback himself. Most people naturally focus on the player competing for the position, but in situations like this, there are other people with something at stake as well. Every analyst who confidently predicted failure, every commentator who dismissed the possibility of significant development, every personality who treated the outcome as already decided, their evaluations are also being tested. That's what makes this story bigger than a normal quarterback competition. It's become a public record of opinions, predictions, and assumptions that can eventually be measured against reality. Imagine for a moment what happens if Shedeur wins the starting role and begins producing positive results, not necessarily becoming an MVP candidate overnight, not immediately turning into one of the league's elite quarterbacks, just performing well enough to justify the confidence Browns coaches and executives have publicly expressed. Suddenly, every conversation that took place over the past several months gets revisited. Every declaration becomes fair game for scrutiny. Every confident prediction faces a second examination. Fans began pulling old clips, old quotes, and old arguments back into the spotlight. The same media environment that rewards bold opinions can quickly become unforgiving when those opinions prove inaccurate. That's one reason why training camp and preseason carry so much importance. They're not just opportunities for players to compete, they're opportunities for narratives to survive or collapse. Every practice rep becomes another piece of evidence. Every preseason drive becomes another data point. Every positive performance increases the pressure on critics who have remained unwilling to adjust their evaluations. Conversely, every mistake gives those critics new ammunition. That's why the stakes feel so high. The debate isn't frozen anymore. It's approaching the moment where reality starts demanding answers. What's easy to forget is that the Browns themselves have been searching for stability at quarterback for decades. Few franchises in professional sports have experienced as much uncertainty at the position. Seasons have come and gone, draft picks have arrived and departed, expectations have risen and fallen. Through all of it, one question has remained remarkably consistent: who will finally become the long-term answer? That's why the possibility of Shedeur emerging as a legitimate option creates so much excitement. For supporters, this isn't simply about proving analysts wrong. It's about ending a search that has frustrated an entire fan base for years. And that's exactly why the reactions have become so emotional. People aren't arguing over a backup quarterback. They're arguing over the possibility of a franchise-changing player. Those conversations naturally become more intense because the stakes are larger. Hope creates emotion. Expectations create emotion. The possibility of finally solving a long-standing problem creates emotion. That's why every report coming out of Cleveland generates such strong responses. Fans understand what's potentially at stake. The fascinating part is that even Browns decision-makers aren't claiming victory yet. Their comments have consistently focused on development rather than guarantees. They've praised progress rather than declaring a winner. They've emphasized growth rather than making bold predictions. That's a crucial distinction because it reflects how organizations typically approach young quarterbacks. They understand that development is rarely linear. Setbacks happen, adjustments happen, challenges emerge. The journey from promising prospect to successful starter is almost never as smooth as fans hope.
Yet despite all those realities, the optimism surrounding Shedeur inside the organization appears difficult to ignore. The coaching staff sounds encouraged, the office sounds encouraged, reports from practices continue generating discussion. Whether that optimism ultimately translates into success remains unknown, but it certainly doesn't sound like the language of people preparing to move on. It sounds like the language of people who believe something meaningful may be taking shape. And if they're right, the implications extend far beyond one player, because if Shedeur Sanders succeeds in Cleveland, it won't simply be viewed as a football story, it will become a case study in how quickly narratives can separate from reality. It will become an example of why draft position doesn't always determine destiny. It will become a reminder that development often happens away from cameras, away from headlines, and away from public debate. Most importantly, it will become proof that confidence from coaches and executives sometimes deserves more attention than opinions from people watching from a distance. Of course, none of this guarantees a happy ending. The NFL doesn't hand out success because a story sounds compelling. Every quarterback eventually has to earn it on the field. Every player faces moments that reveal whether the potential people talk about actually exists. Shedeur Sanders will face those moments too. Defenses won't care about off-season praise. Opposing coordinators won't care about positive headlines. The only thing that matters in the NFL is performance. But that's exactly why the next few months are so important. For the first time, the debate is moving toward a point where speculation begins giving way to evidence. Soon, people won't have to wonder what Shedeur Sanders can become. They'll start seeing what he actually is. And if his development continues following the path Browns coaches and executives have described, a lot of people may find themselves revisiting opinions they once believed were unquestionable. Because the biggest twist in this entire story wouldn't be Shedeur Sanders winning the job. The biggest twist would be discovering that the people who spent the most time warning everyone about him were the ones who misunderstood the situation from the very beginning.